Hello everybody. We have over 230 guests from 35 countries joining us for today's in-session talk, Typographic Abstraction, the shift from semantics to spectacle. Before introducing you to our guests, allow me to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded. We will be able to share a link to the recording after the event. We aim to have an interactive session today, and we invite you to ask questions by using the Q&A button. You're also able to upvote any questions you find interesting to hear answered by our panel. Please use the chat button if you have any technical difficulties regarding the webinar. Please join me in welcoming Adrian, Charlotte, Mark, and Jack. I'm going to hand you over now to Adrian, who's going to start today's conversation.
Well, thank you, Katie. Hi, everyone. It's very nice to know that we've got people from all over the world. So thank you all for joining. So what have we got to talk about today? Well, we're going to talk about this strange thing that we're calling typographic abstraction. And I'm going to make a very short introduction to the subject and just try and set some parameters, some frames around what we're going to talk about. And then the three guests, Charlotte, Mark, and Jack, are going to make individual presentations about how they deal with this question, how they are involved in making work that in some ways adheres to this concept. So let me offer a brief introduction. If we accept that typography is the art of arranging mechanically rendered letter forms to express linguistic meaning, then without typography, there will be no literature, no written instructions, much less sharing of knowledge, and we'd be without numberless manifestations of non-verbal communication. Imagine a world without road signs, medical instructions, the cooking arrangements on a packet of fish fingers. We need typography to inform, instruct, educate, and entertain us. In his famous book, The Gutenberg Galaxy, Marshall McLuhan argued that the invention of movable type led to the standardization of language and the rise of more linear and rational thought processes. McLuhan contended that the printed word, with its uniformity and fixity, resulted in what he called an homogenized worldview, and in turn gave rise to a new form of being, which he called typographic man. Now, McLuhan was writing in 1962, and that was before mass media went supernova. It was before the internet became embedded in our daily lives. McLuhan died in 1980, so he might be surprised to see how the role of typography has changed. We now occupy a world where, in many instances, emojis, pictograms, symbols have come to replace the written word. Has this led to more uniformity and fixity or less uniformity and fixity? Well, we'll discuss this some other time because it's out with the parameters of this conversation, but it's an interesting thought. But for sure, typography has shifted on its axis. Where once it was almost exclusively concerned with semantic meaning, it's now a sort of visual semaphore, where the choice of typeface is often as important as the message it conveys. We sense its meaning before we read its linguistic intentions. And as we move deeper and deeper into an ever more visual culture, typography appears to be untethering itself from its traditional role. And of course, we do written language a disservice if we fail to acknowledge the visual beauty of typographic form. Some might call it the materiality of language. When rendered with care on a page, on a screen, or even in the built environment, the form and arrangement of letters, words, paragraphs has an inherent beauty that is independent of its syntactical purposes. Admittedly, it's easy to see that how pure graphic form, how pure typographic form, the shape of letters, appeals to graphic designers. It's like a builder in love with bricks. But I would argue that that if we stretch our definition of typography to include letter forms, we find many examples of typographic abstraction, or at least typographic semi-abstraction. We only need to consider the pleasure of seeing the neon signs of nighttime Tokyo. You don't need to be a Japanese speaker to understand and feel the excitement of that. Or the exquisite allure of the carved Latin inscriptions on classical architecture. You don't have to speak Latin to appreciate them. Or the brush and ink compositions of the Chinese calligrapher. You don't have to speak the language to see the beauty and to be enchanted by it. So, to explore the notion of typography, the idea that typography has evolved beyond its long-established role as a conveyor of lexical meaning and moved into the realm of abstract, semi-abstract, performative, and non-linguistic states, I'm joined by three practitioners who, in their different and highly individual ways, are shifting typography into a post-semantic realm of visual expression. So that's my introduction. I hope that made sense. I'm sure people will let me know in the chat if it didn't. But I'm going to ask Charlotte to introduce herself briefly and to talk about her super interesting work. Charlotte.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. I'm really excited to be here, also with the two of you, Jack and Mark, and everybody else joining today. I'm Charlotte. I completed a practice-based PhD in communication research at the RCA. I'm currently an independent researcher and lecturer, always looking for interesting projects. My focus is on typography and human-computer interaction, with a particular interest in the non-semantic, the nonsensical, and illegible. And in my presentation, I'm quickly gonna go through some projects and the kind of research I'm working on. Yeah, Sophie, if we can go to the next slide. So a lot of my practice takes reference to something called asemic writing. This is an example by the artist Henri Michaud. Next slide. In a confrontation with asemic writing, we try to read. And we are frustrated in our visual interaction with what appears to be written, an interactive dynamic that is actually contradictory to what we do as typographers and designers. So good design, good typography, user-friendly design is never disturbing or irritating, but responsive and clear and efficient. And we are usually taught to foster the familiar and to reinforce human control and power, and to compensate complexity, an approach which, in my opinion, does no longer really respond to the problems of today's reality, where it should be rather about questioning and challenging familiar patterns. So my work always tries to create and attend these spaces that push action and thought beyond these repetitive individual patterns. In my PhD, I began to explore the interactive potential of asemic writing's dynamic through a practice of creative coding. So human-computer interaction is commonly reduced to this linear and prescribed causality between human action and computer reaction. Asemic writing's dynamic translated into this context could probably look something like that. So there's an unexpected dissonance in the causal relation between my mouse's position and the computer reaction. And this opens up a space for what I in my work call the uncausal, where interaction is not determined or means to an end, but creates spaces for creation and discovery. So what I became interested in is to explore how interaction with technology could trigger new ways of acting and thinking rather than automating or externalizing habitual and familiar patterns. So I created over 200 visually abstract mini interfaces that challenge program logics of causality and experience, and the programs are interlinked to a huge network of interactions. So on each web page, as you see here, there's 4 different programs with slightly different logics. Yeah, next slide, please. So that when moving on from one program to the next, the action has to be reevaluated based on the specific context. And this is a time lapse just to give you an insight. So the interaction creates situations that prevent control, that push me out of my habit, and the lines remain as traces of this interaction. And also programming itself became for me about this iterative examination of the causal relation between action and reaction and human and machine and process and product. Yeah, this is just a picture of the exhibition setup. Also wanted to show some more projects from earlier. So ephemeral typing is an ongoing series of experimental writing or typing programs. In contrast to conventional writing, forms are not predefined, but are generated in the act of writing, like in asemic writing. And the focus is solely on the gesture of typing as this act of discovery. Yes, these are just a few examples of my programs. And in this project, I began to treat these computer-generated characters like writing, so similar to a child learning to write for the first time, repeating shapes over and over again. And this was also a starting point for my project Langue Trouvée in reference to Marcel Duchamp's Objet Trouvé. The Langue Trouvée is a computer-generated non-semantic form that is interacted with in the same way as writing. So the program that was exhibited here references the aesthetic of a digital learn-to-write software. So users trace the lines as precisely as possible and create this dialogue between form and performer. And this act of imitation transforms these forms into writing. So it's about this conscious play between conditioning and deconditioning and the learning of characters that will never be repeated again. This is a project I've been working on for a paper for the publication Politics of Machines, which will be published soon. And here I explored the concept of what I call parasitic interfaces. Parasites here are external factors that infect the text editor, so to speak. So they change the logic of the program. This could be minimal changes like a missing cursor or non-functioning backspace, or a change in linearity up to complete distortions of letter forms. So sometimes a combination of parasites can have hardly any effect, and other times it can trigger unexpected chain reactions or even cause the program to crash. So the parasite is not destructive per se, but intrudes this closed system and brings potential for change and creative processes in this dynamic interplay between human and machine. Yeah, I think we can quickly go through the next slides. These are just some screenshots. Yeah, next. Yeah. And this is a project I've been working on for Echo Journal as part of a paper that explores what I call the space of the magic orb. This should be published soon as well. So in leading generative AI interfaces, the text field becomes the primary interface between human action and machine response. It's quite interesting that from direct manipulation paradigms, so from clicking and seeing a result, we are back to writing. And this confronts us again with a bigger leap between input and output, between prompt and result, that is compensated and mystified by this magical AI iconography like spinning orbs and magic wands and purple sparkles. And in this project, I explore this magical space between human and machine, not as a gap to be compensated for, but a space to be explored and even deliberately expanded. And that engages users in this choreographic potential of the interaction. Yeah, these are some versions, but I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to move on to the next project. The last project is the practice-based element of a paper I'm currently working on. I think we have to go back one page. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, a paper for pseudo-script conference and publication in Italy this year. So this is still work in progress. I don't think the video is playing. Could you try again? Maybe go back and forth. Oh yeah, okay, cool. So in the act of typing, the keyboard is the primary touching point between human action and computer response. And at the same time, the keyboard is mostly this passive entity. So we select a font to change the effect of our interaction on the computer screen. So our interaction is an execution of pre-programmed parameters. And here instead we can write on rather than through the keyboard, and the interaction can be sort of reprogrammed and rewritten on the go, and there's no determinate functionality. And again, this idea that the type is created in the interaction where typing becomes about exploring an action and a context. So yeah, I'm gonna leave it here, and yeah, looking forward to the other presentation. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful, Charlotte. Really, really interesting. And I remember when you were a long time ago, when you were a student, well, not so long ago, but when you were a student at the RCA and you were looking into asemic writing. What I think's super interesting is the way asemic writing and your work with computer interfaces is challenges McLuhan's notion of the fixity of written typographic language. It's fixed, and therefore, and what he went on to say was that creates its own fixed mindset. So I think it's very interesting the way your work and asemic writing in particular challenges that.
Yeah, I think also, I mean, should I
Yeah.
respond right away, or do we have
of course,
to yeah, I think all of my work is actually based on a frustration with typography and its fixity, and that, like, I was always interested in interactive typography, but what I was lacking was that the interaction itself would create something new rather than being this passive, action reaction. And I think, yeah, like you are referring to McLuhan, and he's saying that it relates to this fixity in mind, and that's something I'm trying to problematize in my work, that, the way we interact with typography is in symbiosis with the way we interact in the world and also with technology. So I think that's super interesting.
Absolutely. Well, that was great. Thank you. Really, really interesting. So we're on time, we're on schedule, so that's good. I'm going to ask Mark next to show us his work. Mark, over to you.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Adrian. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, fine.
So. Yeah.
Great. So we only have 10 minutes. We're going to get into that. So yeah, my name's Mark Webster. I'm an artist and a teacher working and living in France. I've worked in the creative industries now for well over 20 years. But actually my art practice is very new. And having only started a few years ago, actually starting to put some work out. So when Adrian asked me to participate in this talk, I thought it would be a good idea to maybe kind of pinpoint some themes that have been going through my work, and especially themes that revolve around language. Now, I should kind of make it clear from the start that I'm not a typographer. a lot of my work does revolve around the topic of language and language at large. And obviously, typography is a very important aspect of that. It also just happens that I've kind of been hanging out and been surrounded by typographers for a long part of my professional life. So yeah, when I was preparing this talk, we can go on to the next slide. There was this question that kind of came up, a kind of reflective question, which was, what has become apparent to me within my practice? And so to kind of give some answers to this, I'm going to try to present 3 art projects. I say present, so I'm probably just going to briefly show you some of these projects because I'm going to do it in 10 minutes, which is quite a feat. So these 3 projects are entitled Hypertype, Cosmic Poems, and Distracted. We can go to the next slide. Now, before I kind of dive into that task of showing 3 projects, I thought it would be important to pinpoint or just point out 2 things about my work in general. Firstly, I mentioned that I'm not a typographer, but it turns out that I actually worked with letters for a very, very long time. And I've worked with letters mostly with my students, giving workshops or, just working with my students in general. And my practice is perhaps particular in that it's always been about exploring letter form. So not typography, but exploring letter form and exploring that from a system kind of based approach, which is very different from the more academic and traditional approach of typeface design, which is very much linked with the hand, with drawing and calligraphy. Go on to the next slide. So this is the second point. To actually explore letter form, I do this through code, and that's another particular part of my practice. I work with code as my main medium and programming as my main means for both structuring ideas and then exploring those ideas and implementing them. So here what you have on the screen is just a very small screenshot of a program. So you have the code on the left, and on the right you have a little visual of what this program does, which was part of a little research project I had with a friend of mine. And I wanted to make a quick program where I could make my own bitmap fonts. So those 2 things are kind of important with my practice. So let's just jump on to these 3 projects. The first project I'm going to talk about is Hypertype. So the photo here that you're seeing is a photo taken of an exhibition in London in 2022. And Hypertype is a generative art piece that took form as an exhibition of 5 artist-curated prints, and then 150 unique editions that were generated from a program that sits on the blockchain. You can go to the next slide. So here you have just a kind of a few images, a few iterations from the program to give you an idea of the kind of variety of images that are coming from this program. Now, Hypertype is a conceptual piece. It seeks to draw attention to a specific topic that is labeled affective computing. And this particular belief that machines can somehow infer emotional meaning from text. So Hypertype is also a means for me to kind of question that very premise. Next, probably move, you should be moving this. The next project is Cosmic Poems, which again is a purely typographic, purely typographical project. But here the main ideas are motivated by something very, very different. They're motivated by my interest in the early concrete poets and that whole movement. Now, whereas in hypertype, the kind of typographic elements retain a certain linear structure, and words can be read, and phrases can be read, and you can get some meaning. In cosmic poems, the idea was to kind of break that up a little bit, and even though you can read certain elements, the idea was to kind of liberate the typographic elements from this kind of strict structure. The rigid structure that we find in a traditional text layout. We can move on to the next slide. So here's just a few other images, iterations of the development of that. We'll go on to the next slide. So this idea of wanting to I kind of like take the basic elements of linguistic elements and break them up and free them up from the page. I kind of took it to a kind of more radical level in this last project, which is called Distracted. And so the idea here was really, to kind of like, well, I mean, all the elements that you're seeing here were made from typographic elements that were made from type, text, the various fonts. There are sometimes words, and the idea was to basically to break these up. You can probably move on to the next slide, please. So it's to break up these elements, to transform them, to slice them, displace them. And again, the idea was to disrupt the kind of typographic geometry and this linear nature of text. We can move on to the next slide. And so I kind of take it, I guess, to the extent where at some point language completely loses its semantic role. And as you can see in these two last images, and it becomes, pure visual form. And so that was something that, I was looking to explore in this last project. We can go to the last slide. So I'm just going to show the last slide, a little animation taken from the generative system that was used to make those images. So, the system is quite simple. It uses typographic elements, letters, sometimes text, and then I put into motion some kind of animation that breaks it up, displaces it, disrupts it. And what interests me is, the result of that. What happened from, this breaking up of the elements. So again, I guess just to go back to the original question, kind of like finish off. What's become apparent to me is that actually throughout my work and throughout these last few years of working on these projects, language has kind of lost its semantic role slowly, and I've become more and more interested in what Adrian was talking about, this materiality, so the pure shape and form of letters, and so breaking it up and just turning it into something quite different. So yeah, I think I could leave it there. Thanks you.
Oh, that was great. I mean, great, really good, and brilliant timekeeping too. It's interesting. Your last remarks kind of sort of took I had a question forming in my head, but your last remarks took it away. But I suppose I was thinking along the lines of, I mean, where you use letter forms, you're mostly, I think, exclusively using the Latin alphabet. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but knowing you, I think you've studied Chinese, haven't you? You've looked into.
Yes, I did. Yes.
Could you make work with non-Latin alphabets?
I could do.
Will you?
Well, I have done. I think in Cosmic Poems, I slipped in some Chinese characters. Will I? Well, it's funny you say that because I've recently taken up my hand again. I'm using my hand, and I'm actually doing engraving, and so I'm doing a lot of a little bit what Charlotte's doing, so kind of doing a semic writing.
Mm.
And I do find myself, because I studied Chinese for 7 years.
Yeah.
So, I studied how the written language. And it's funny, my jest, I have that kind of Chinese. It's there. I write in a particular way, and it kind of comes back to me. And I find myself making silly shapes and silly kind of characters that have, well, not characters, not Chinese characters, but they have the form and shape of Chinese characters.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very, very interesting. Well, it's wonderful work, and we should give your new book a plug. You've got a book coming out that covers in much more detail the work you've shown us. So people should look out for that. Great, thank you, Mark, and
you
brilliant.
have contributed to that book as well. Thank you, Adrian.
Oh, I did. Yes, I did. I'm very happy to do so. Right, Jack, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Adrian. And super nice to see Charlotte and Mark's work. Oddly, I feel slightly like the traditionalist in the room, which is a weird position for me to be in. Usually I'm the one spouting all the weird kind of avant-garde ideas. But hi, I'm Jack Llewellyn. I'm a practicing, I suppose, commercial designer, currently at Pentagram. I'll talk about that in a second. I suppose really the only background you need to know from me in regards to this presentation is that I mostly work and think and express through typography. So I'm working in kind of brand, various different sectors from technology, culture, sport, all sorts of different things, but typography really is the through line. What you're seeing on screen is just a random assortment of kind of typographic explorations that I've done over the past years. I think we can move on to the next slide. But as I say, I work commercially primarily. Originally, that was at Brodie Associates after I graduated from the RCA. Out there with Neville Brodie, who some of you will have no doubt heard of. And now I'm at Pentagram at team Jodie and Luke Hudson Powell, where we make a lot of, I suppose, digital focused brand work. So what I'm going to show you, move on, is a collection of, I suppose, slightly more recent, probably over the last 5 or 6 years, different commercial projects that were undertaken by me or by the Pentagram team here, or collectively, that have featured typography as a primary aspect. And I suppose I want to look at a few different ways that I feel as though the definition of type has been shifted. And having looked at the two previous presentations, we are seeing quite extreme kind of avant-garde definitions of typography. In contrast to that, I think a lot of these projects are maybe more normal, quote unquote, expressions of type, but where I think, as I say, I'll explain how I think that the definition has kind of shifted somewhat. So firstly, a project that was released maybe a year and a half ago, something like that now. It's a big project for us at Pentagram where we rebranded Channel 4. And a theme over the recent years is that a lot of brands now come to Pentagram or come to other design agencies and are really conscious of owning typographic style. If we move on to the next slide, some of you may be familiar, at least people who are based in the UK may already be familiar with Channel 4 and its typographic style. We developed a bespoke typeface for them at Neville's studio, Brodie Associates, in 2016, and then our recent project at Pentagram kind of updated that and extended the language. But as I say, lots of brands now are looking to kind of own this typographic style, which is an interesting paradox in that typography in a traditional sense is a tool for designers to use expressively for many, many purposes. And even though there will be kind of elements of kind of cultural or technological kind of heritage within them, kind of definable stylistic movements, what we often see in our commercial work now is that we're creating typefaces that are really intended for one message and one voice and are owned by one entity or person. So almost a kind of as I say, a paradoxical kind of restriction of the expression of typography. And in that way, the type is kind of serving I suppose a stylistic, its function is to be stylistically individual and recognizable, rather than necessarily a kind of a crystal goblet for communication, if you know that reference. It's a very old reference. If we keep moving forward, so you can see here the kind of ownable style of Channel 4. Let's keep going. You can kind of check those out online. A kind of a second example of this was a typeface that we created for a video game for Warhammer Total War, for Sega and Creative Assembly. And this was kind of tapping into, I think a lot of our projects, we try to build worlds around brands, kind of narrative worlds that these brands exist in, and their kind of communicative position exists in, and the typefaces become these extensions of them. And an interesting kind of quote that I heard a while ago from Colophon Foundry is they said that typography is now not function, typography is fashion. And I think I feel that change in trend, or I have felt that change in trend kind of over the last few years, as I say, where now we're creating typefaces that are there to express a stylistic world and are less concerned with functional rigor. Keep going. But despite that being our day-to-day, we do have a number of kind of very experimental projects. This one was from 2019. As you can see on here, we had a long-standing relationship with London Fashion Week, where we would do their identities, seasonal identities. And this one in particular, we created a generative typeface, which, as I kind of alluded to before, was much less concerned with legibility and much more concerned with a sensibility, a tonal sensibility. And this was a typeface that was not only in the promotional materials, but used kind of throughout the space. And it was there to signify, much in the same way, I think, as some of Charlotte's work, it was there to signify the gesture of writing and mark making and an intervention into the space, of being a kind of a monogram or an acronym rather. It's relatively easy to read, LFW, but we used it kind of so abstractly in many places that it was there to symbolize the intervention of writing as opposed to be eminently legible. And then we stacked these kind of other semantic qualities to do with kind of materiality in 3D rendering, rather than stylistic typographic construction. Moving to a greater extreme, we produced a project for Somerset House. They were putting on an exhibition about mushrooms in art. And we looked at the expression of that identity and said, okay, well, how can we communicate the idea of mushrooms through typography? And it's really a kind of a dumb answer to that question. We said, well, let's grow mushrooms that write. So we worked with a machine learning kind of specialist studio who helped us create effectively simulations of mycelium networks. And we grew typefaces. There are many projects kind of over the years that have touched on this idea of creating typography through organic forms. Often their restriction is that they create a container and then they grow something within it. So the thing that you're left with is just a depiction of that container with a textural application rather than actually growing a letterform. And we strove to do something different and actually kind of simulate growth in a bit more of an interesting way. So whilst we did start with a pseudo container, it was the idea of kind of high growth areas and low growth areas, which would give a base form of a letter shape. We inbuilt possibility for kind of mutation and discrepancy from that almost guideline that we set out. And this tool that we created means that when you type on the keyboard, each letter form is effectively grown from scratch, and we create these varying levels of abstraction. So here you can kind of see that base container and then the mutations that start to spring out from that and start to abstract the letter form. And then there's all sorts of other ideas in here. You know, these letter forms are kind of natively dimensional, even though we're looking at it from a 2D perspective currently. And we actually created this tool, or published this tool online. I can probably post the link later. It's hypha H, dyslexic, let me spell it, HYPHA, twice, hypha.com, and you can actually go and try that out for yourself online. And here we were, I suppose, inadvertently creating abstraction and very intentionally creating the, I suppose, communicative visual of mushrooms with typography as a substrate to build on, which was very unconcerned with the fact that it was supposed to be typography and functional typography at its base. And then just the final project where we, I suppose, moved a little bit more back into legibility. As I say, I think through typography primarily, or at least think through kind of typographic form in most of my projects. And where I suppose I have more of a playground to look at that was I did used to run a workshop at the RCA on the visual communication course. Charlotte was there for some of it a long time ago, where we would look at I suppose the digital materiality of typography. And, you know, I've referenced Charlotte a number of times now, but in the same way that, or I suppose a similar goal that she's striving for, the materiality of writing and language. This workshop was geared towards accessing a digitally native material expression of typography. And this typeface that I released a year ago with NAN Foundry in Berlin was a culmination of some of the research that happened within that workshop and some of the ideas that were kicking about there. And the express goal of this project was to create letter forms that were digitally native. The reference in these materials to Spaceland and Flatland, to the story Flatland by J. Abbott Miller. These letter forms are created by a overlapping Boolean relationship between two shapes. So they're two shapes that exist in the same 3D space and cut between each other. So something that would be, I suppose, conceptually divorced from a two-dimensional flat kind of printed surface, and something that you can only really explore in three-dimensional space. And whilst the concept of this typeface was playing with this idea of, or question of what could be a digital materiality of typography, ultimately it collapsed down into a typographic style that came full circle back into a functional two-dimensional typeface, albeit with some kind of dynamic variable elements that users can play around with. And the last couple of pages are some of the materials that were used in the promotion of that, and you can kind of see on the right-hand side these two Boolean shapes that are interlocking or intersected to produce the ultimate letter form. So in a way, a relatively straightforward typographic style, but one that looked at, or the intention of the project was to look more broadly to digital form, digital materiality, and as a result, an abstraction of typography into that space in order to find I suppose, a new expression. And that was the goal. Final slide of the full character set. So thank you. Hopefully that was relatively clear in a bit of a journey across how even in a relatively traditional commercial space that within Pentagram or within kind of my own published works, some of these questions about typographic materiality and typographic abstraction filter through into at least the conceptual thinking that push forward, hopefully, interesting new aesthetic styles. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Jack. And yes, it certainly did. And one of the main reasons why I wanted you as part of this was that I think you're bringing some of these ideas around abstraction and you're bringing them into the commercial realm. And one thing you didn't mention, and you and I run which some of the listeners might be interested in, you and I run an RCA short course on typography, which people can find out about. And one of the things you talk about, and I'm always intrigued by it, is this idea of typographic behavior. And could you just say a few words about your thoughts around what you mean by that?
Sure. I mean, I think in a way, all of the work that we've seen today fits under this category, and in a very short, kind of simple version of this. I'm sure many of you have kind of heard the argument that we are running out of typographic styles, that at some point, I think Emma Gray, Rudy van der Lands, I think I may have got that wrong, called it the typographic fill-in, the idea that there are only so many styles that we can express. And whilst I don't agree with that, if we take that as a very simple reductive base premise, we can build on top of formal typographic style into the world of behavior. So we're saying it's not just about how it looks, but it's how it moves, or it's how it talks to you, or it's how you can touch it, or it's how it lives and grows or exists within the world. These behavioral elements, rather than just visual elements, can or are intrinsically part of the communicative value of typography. I mean, I think you can apply that to any medium really, but in my world, that's through typography. So behavioral typography is making an addition to aesthetic and formal qualities, and I suppose extending communicative potential as a result.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point to make in relation to your work and in relation to the traditional use of typography. It can have this expanded role. So thank you for expanding on that. So I notice we don't have any questions in the chat, which I hope we will have. We've got time because everybody's kept to their allotted period, so we've got time. So please post some questions. In the meantime, I just want to ask Charlotte to maybe just give some thoughts about where she sees her research, her practice going. Is there a destination in mind? And one thing I thought of when I was watching your presentation is funny enough, it reminded me of some work I've seen on teaching coding. You might think this is a bit nuts, but teaching coding to 5-year-olds. And it's not a million miles away from what you're doing. So I wonder if you could just give some thoughts on where your practice might develop.
Yeah, no, I really like your analogy of teaching children coding, because a lot of my work is about this basic form of interaction, like Jack talked about it before, that I think we are communicating more and more in flexible, interactive environment. And typography, is about interaction, is about the way we interact with technology. So my work is, typography is where I'm coming from, which is my background, but I see my work moving more and more away from that, like thinking about how my typographic perspective or background could actually open up the discipline to contribute to other fields as well, like how we interact with the computer, because like I said before, I think it's all connected, and that sort of came out in the course of my PhD as well, that it's the way we design, the way we interact with technology, the way we write. It's all based on, supporting our habitual ways of thinking and acting. And so, I don't know actually where I see my practice going, but I think that's so exciting for me also about aesthetic writing, because it's not about arriving somewhere, it's not about a destination, but really, exploring different fields where this work could live, sort of.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. No. Very, very interesting. Now, Sophie's just pointed out that there are some questions that are in, I was looking in the chat, but they're actually in a thing called Q&A. So I've got them in front of me. There's some really interesting and quite detailed questions, which we're probably not going to have time to deal with, although we'll see if we can follow up with some of them. There was one that sort of jumped out at me, and it's from Bernice Wong. And I think maybe this is one for you, Mark. I'll just read it very quickly. What are your opinions on language dominance, language colonialism? Not sure if this is exactly the term for it, but the idea that English is the most learnt and dominant language for higher education. Can your practice in typography and letter forms challenge that? Well, I think yours does, doesn't it? Would you agree with that? That you're challenging the dominance of language in its traditional forms?
It's a very,
particularly the
very,
Latin alphabet?
a very, very good question. I don't really have any convincing answer. There's lots of answers to that. Personally, I actually come from a languages background. I mean, I went to university and studied languages. I went to study French and I studied Chinese. And for me, those languages always been an important part of me being able to access other cultures. I couldn't understand another culture without not having the language, so it was important for me. The whole thing about dominant language, well, I mean, it just so happens that in our history that certain languages have become, the dominant language. I mean, that is what it is. I really don't know how to answer that at all. Does my work challenge it? Not directly. It's not something that kind of I'm conscious of. I'm very conscious of the fact that language is very much a part of my work, and of course language is there to transmit meaning. You want to signify something, or you want to explain something, you want to express something, and my work is kind of gradually some of it, not all of it, but some of it kind of taking that away, and just a bit like what Jack was saying, this idea of just having a form that is, sensibility. Is that the word you used, Jack? Yeah, something, where you just have pure form, and then you feel something about that. And you kind of talked about it as well, Adrian, in the beginning of the presentation. You say where, you can enjoy walking in Japan and seeing these neon signs or Chinese calligraphy, and you can appreciate it just for its pure form. Does it mean something to you? I'm sure it does. Does it convey a message to you? I'm sure it does. It's not necessarily the message that language is probably. I mean, the words that have been used, but it does convey meaning. Again, I haven't answered the question at all, but
well, I think you've given it a good attempt, and I think it's a very difficult question for anyone to answer. It's a philosophical question. I'm looking at all the questions, and there are so many really interesting ones. I notice Neville Brody, who I'm pleased to say has joined us. Neville's a professor on the visual communication course. Many of you will know him anyway, but he's a professor on the visual communication course. I'm going to read his question, but I don't think we're going to have time to answer it, Neville. So, but you ask, would the panel agree that the rapidly increasing reductionism of modern communication and social space, so I think we know what that is, everything's reduced to sound bites and instant communication, has this led to you say it has led to a decrease in typographic sophistication and the need now for brands to identify themselves through the instantaneous ownership of specific typographic forms, often spurious. And I think, Jack, you touched on that, didn't you? You touched on the whole question of ownership of typographic form. And for me, it's the ownership of the visual. It's where the visual is as important as the message. You own these forms. For, corporations, brands, institutions own these forms as much as they own the message. So, Neville, that's a really hurried and brief response to your question. I wish we had more time, but we've actually only got 3 minutes left. Just one last thought, and this is something that Jack and I talk a lot about, and that is the importance of fuse. Neville's typographic experiments, which he conducted in the 90s, began in the 90s. And anyone who's interested in this subject, the subject we've been talking about, I heartily recommend that they find out more about fuse and Neville's experiment. So I'm going to say thank you very much to our 3 panelists. Thanks to everyone who asked a question, and I'm so sorry we haven't been able to deal with them all because they're really good questions, very thoughtful. And I'm going to hand back to Katie.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you to everyone who joined us for today's talk. Adrian, Charlotte, Mark, and Jack, thank you all for sharing your work and being so generous today. Don't worry if you guys missed anything. We'll share a link to the recording of the session with everyone who registered to the event.
Hey, Katie, can we share the Q&A?
Yeah, we can pass over the questions to you guys.
Yeah.
And then
I think they're really good questions, and people put in some good thoughts as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, happy to do that. As Adrian mentioned earlier, Adrian and Jack run a typography course every summer in June, and there are still some places left if you're interested in joining us. Thank you for your time. Have a lovely rest of your day.